Our reading from the gospel this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke. It is interesting reading for today because we don't actually see the resurrected Jesus. We kind of see the empty space where he should have been. So this is the story of the women going to the tomb. This is found in Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and on the third day rise again." And then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. This is the gospel of the Lord. If you are a regular at this church, you have heard me talk about my maternal grandmother. She was a safe space in my life as a young adult, as a kid, a stable presence, a person who loved me no matter what and who taught me things about kindness and imagination and courage. So much of my time was spent sitting at her kitchen table, laughing with her and learning from her, crying to her, and of course, eating. And always at that table, I felt like better was possible. She made lots of room for me to dream, and she made lots of room for me to ask questions about a world I hadn't quite figured out yet, that she hadn't quite figured out yet either. And she believed firmly in the unbelievable. She believed that miracles happened. And she believed in things that cannot be seen or explained. I was at the hospital in the room at her bedside when she took her last breath. In that final moment, my whole world fell apart. Suddenly, everything was dark and cold, and I was pretty sure that I had died too. I exited the hospital room almost collapsing onto the floor, and I entered a tomb. In the early dawn of Sunday morning, in the aftermath of the crucifixion, after the world went dark and felt cold, and silence had settled on the faithful, a group of women made their way to the tomb of Christ. They were going there to finish the preparation of his body with spices, a common funeral practice of the time. They were grieving, of course, the loss of Jesus. Jesus was taken away by fear and injustice and cruelty and cowardice, subjected to torture and torment, crucified on a cross built of human sin. And these women had seen horrible things over the past few days. And as they arrived at the tomb, they noticed that the stone had been rolled away. The tomb was open, and the tomb was empty. Jesus wasn't there. They stood there, stunned, and then Luke tells us that these two men in dazzling clothes suddenly appeared beside them. Angels. That's our common understanding. And they almost reprimand the women by saying, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. And then the angels go on to remind the women that Jesus told them that this was going to happen. Jesus told them exactly what was going to happen, and it did happen. And the women, Mary Magdalene and Joanna, Mary, mother of James, and others, responded by rushing away from the tomb to tell others what had happened. And of course, the disciples, being the disciples, didn't believe them. So Peter went to check for himself. And he found only Christ's linen clothes lying in the tomb, and he was, as Luke says, amazed. Why do you look for the living among the dead? Easter is a time we gather to proclaim the idea that we are a resurrection people. A resurrection people, that Christ is risen, that sin and death have been conquered, that the tomb is empty, end of the story, close the book, nice and neat and clean. But why do we still look for the living among the dead? Why do we look for life in the works of death? How do we explain looking for life in things like bigotry or apathy, in the poison of our anger and the toxic fumes of our fear, and our grave-like obsession with a past that we cannot change and we cannot bring back? Why are we convinced that we will find life in war or violence or vengeance or oppression? How is it that we claim to be alive when we perpetuate the systems of poverty and oppression that take life away from so many people? How can we claim the resurrection while we are still trying to roll the stone back in front of the door, to trap Jesus again? God chose women to be the first witnesses of the resurrection. In God's eyes, equality had already started. The resurrection meant that the resurrection was for everyone, that salvation was for everyone, that everyone would now be faithful servants of Christ, even women. Even me, even you. The insiders, the disciples, they became the skeptics of this story. The outsiders, the women, who worked along the edge, probably financing a lot of the work going on, these women became the evangelists of the story. The women teach us that you cannot peer into the empty tomb and remain the same, that you cannot peer into the empty tomb and pretend that the world is the same. You cannot peer into the emptiness of the grave. You cannot know that Jesus defeated death and accept the works of death as normal or tolerable or inevitable. The risen Christ did not just defeat death. He took away our justifications and our excuses for continuing the work of death. He overcame the powers that used fear and oppression to sustain the comfort of some while causing the suffering of many. He defeated the powers that manipulated justice and weaponized our fear to turn us against each other, to perpetuate suffering even further. And when we look into that empty tomb, we as a faithful people understand that there is no going back from this moment. As those women showed us, the good news that the resurrection has occurred, the good news that Christ is risen, the good news that Christ has defeated all of these things, the sin, the darkness, it's not something you just hear, it's something you respond to. It's something that you answer. It's something that calls us to action. We can no longer be silent witnesses or detached observers of something that happened a long time ago. We are no longer waiting, and we can no longer be willing to accept the way that things are. We have seen the empty tomb, and we have been called into action to work and to risk and to challenge, to proclaim that we are a people of a living Christ whose story did not end on a cross or in a tomb, or even in the ascension to heaven. We are the people of a living Christ who still lives, still works, and still loves, and still calls us to the work of resurrection, because a world of death is not what God intended. Christ showed us that no matter how dark it seems, and no matter how venomous the hatred, and no matter how devastating the violence, and no matter how cruel the injustice, no matter how heavy the cross we carry might be, it will never overcome the power of the Savior who left behind the empty tomb. I believe that. I believe that, and I know that there are people in this world, perhaps people sitting here right now, who need to believe that too. They need to believe it because there are people who are hurting, and there are people living in tombs made of hopelessness and pain. People living amid the bombs and the bullets of war. Refugees made homeless by someone else's hunger. There are kids living in fear as law after law is passed to steal away their dignity and stop them from being who they are. People are sick and people are grieving. There are children and families huddled in the streets trying to keep warm. Victims of economic destruction and disaster. Victims of a powerful system that is designed to sustain poverty and to reward greed. There are people right now who are struggling to overcome addictions and mental illness. So many people who aren't even gathered in churches this morning, who aren't sitting in pews to hear this message, but who need in their hearts and their souls to believe truly that the tomb is empty. They need to know that Christ rose in victory over the powers that exploit their suffering and profit from their pain. They need to know that Christ rose and conquered the discrimination that pushes them into the dirt. So many people need to understand that they too are loved by Christ. They are loved by the Christ who cannot die. People need to know that there is a light that cannot be extinguished, a hope that cannot fade, a grace that is bigger and beyond our understanding. Because sometimes, resurrection is the only thing we have to hold on to. When my grandmother died, I went into a tomb. Not a place of grief, not mourning. It was a place of fear. I was certain I could never face the world again without her beside me. I could never face the world again without the strength that she gave me and the wisdom that she gave me. I was afraid because I knew that the world could never be the same again. And then in a moment of revelation, I could hear her voice saying, "What are you doing?" Saying, "I am with you." And then I realized that some part of her had to live in me, that I could internalize all the strength and the wisdom and the courage and the imagination that she had shown me and taught me. I realized that the time had come to leave the tomb and to live. I was looking for her among the dead when I should have been looking for her in the gifts of life that she gave me. I should have been looking for her in the resurrection. Jesus is alive. The women who left that tomb that day, who rushed out to become the evangelists, the first evangelists, I suppose you could say, those women understood that they couldn't stay there, staring into the darkness of an empty tomb. It was now time to act and to live and to internalize all of those things that Jesus had taught them and shown them. It was time to internalize and spread the love that Jesus had given them so often. It was time to live. Jesus is alive. That is the message we hear today. And if we look for him in the tombs that we build, he isn't there. And if we seek him out in the works of death, he isn't there either. And if we build a little tiny box to try to contain him, to try to lock Jesus up in the image of our own fears and our own bigotries, trying to trap Jesus in our ideology, trying to make Jesus one of us, we will gaze into that little box, and two dudes in dazzling clothes are just going to say, he isn't here. He's there. I'm going to be honest, I had trouble deciding what to say on Easter because we are coming together at such a complex and sad time in the world. We are witnessing war. There have been 3 mass shootings in the last week. We are still in a pandemic. It is easy to give in to those things, to accept them as normal, to accept them as life. This is how life is now, to accept that it's inevitable that we must destroy one another. To do that is to enter the tomb, to choose death over life. To do that is to reject Easter, to pretend that Christ never rose, to live at the bottom of the cross instead of walking into the new world. This isn't normal, and it's not okay. And it's okay for us to say that. Because the message of Easter is this: Jesus Christ rose from death so that we could reject the powers of death. Jesus Christ conquered our sin so we could conquer that sin every single day. Jesus rose to spread a new light into a new world, to tell us not to stay here, but to go there, to go out and to spread this message and to spread this love and to speak about things like grace and forgiveness, to speak about peace when peace seems impossible, to believe in things that seem impossible, to believe in miracles, to know that miracles happen. Jesus Christ rose so that we would rise too. And every time we try to get back down again, and every time we try to think that this is all just the way it is, every time we try to look back into the tomb, all we're going to find there are 2 dazzling dudes who will say, he's not here. Jesus Christ is alive. Amen.